Hello, this is Sharon Ng. I am a Yorkville University Masters of Counseling psychology student, and part of my practicum uh, final was to complete a presentation, and my topic chosen was around boundaries for counselors, particularly for new counselors such as myself, and also for existing counselors that might find this topic quite useful. When I was looking through some of the boundaries literature, I did find a study that had noted that new and existing counselors did find that they were ill-equipped for managing boundaries when in practice. Sometimes it could be due to fear of repercussions for reporting this, therefore it didn't make it into any of the ethical training programs. So to fulfill this gap, hopefully this presentation acts as a supplementary to existing training and, and actual practice. So there are three learning objectives that is put together for this presentation. First is to develop a greater awareness of what our boundaries are and how they impact us when they are broken. How to recognize problematic boundaries, and recognizing that boundary concerns do occur along a spectrum, and it's a matter of what point do they become problematic. And through some of the literature, as well as from my personal experience in my close to 8 months of practicum so far, is that all boundary crossings do have some additive effects on impacting us to the point of potential burnout. And within this learning objective, I'm going to refer to our professional codes and standards, specifically with American Psychological Association, APA, and the Canadian Psychological Association, CPA, and particularly what they say around boundary violations and crossings, which are usually a gray area. And then we lead into the last learning objective is to how to enhance our ability and skills to establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries. Again, we look at the existing codes and standards within the regulatory boards, as they do have some ethical decision-making models when simple code referencing isn't enough. Here I also did find a more enhanced critical lens to boost the decision-making model, as well as I did develop some case scenarios from my personal experience so far, and some informed by the LEAP exam, which for those of you are not aware, it's one of the practicing registration exams for psychologists and counselors as well. And so to start, I wanted to share this quote by Tawwab, set boundaries and find peace. And here it offers a more humanistic perspective of setting boundaries as almost a way of being, a way of loving yourself. And it starts with maintaining boundaries with yourself and kind of knowing why you say yes or no, and how saying yes to one thing could mean saying no to another. So if you work overtime with a client, that also means that you're taking the time and energy away from potentially another client or even yourself for self-care. So importantly, it really comes down to knowing yourself in order to have the self-respect to stand firm and also honor the same for our clients as well. So overall, healthy boundaries are kind of like life attitudes, and they do create ripple effects across various areas in our lives. So I really like how this picture captures that ripple effect. And now we go into the boundaries definition divided into personal and professional boundaries. So personal boundaries are limits and rules we set for ourselves within our relationships. they're what connects us and disconnects us as humans, and they're often differentially based. So across situational, cultural, or personality factors, boundaries may differ. So maybe a situational factor could be, waiting in line in a busy, to getting on a busy subway. There's less of boundaries as opposed to perhaps sitting in a park. So in that situation, it's also kind of like a physical situation as well, where boundaries differ. Culturally, could be, disclosing personal information, could be seen as betrayal for some collectivist cultures. But in westernized cultures where I'm from, it could be considered as more of a demonstration of openness. And then some personality factors wherein someone who might be a bit more assertive might hold more firm boundaries. And then we move into professional boundaries, where we talk about the counseling context and really want to specifically divide it to exceptional and unexceptional boundaries. And when these are broken, they could be dynamic. So some acceptable ones would be considered also called boundary crossings. Like I earlier mentioned, they still do have additive stress that could impair judgment in the long run, to the point where it becomes unacceptable. And these are called boundary violations in our codes and standards. And they could be as clear as sexual violation and harassment and financial exploitation. Those are clear violations. And then particularly we move into looking at boundaries in terms of its range. So we can focus at the top model where it's four little men occurring along a range, and can start with the first little man on the far left-hand side, where basically barely has much walling, and we'd identify him as having limited or non-existent boundaries. And some characteristics of this person, and also they're also called porous boundary. Some of the characteristics for this type of boundary would be having acceptance or disrespect from clients. And so if a client is rude or disrespectful, often late, and you still kind of accept this as kind of the standard, that could indicate perhaps low boundaries. And sometimes if a client is requesting for a certain kind of service, such as EMDR, and I'm currently not trained in EMDR, and I do kind of lean into their requests, that not only becomes a boundary crossing, but it is an ethical violation to be providing services that I'm not credited for, or I don't have the required education for. To becoming over involved with clients in businesses that are beyond what they share in counseling. So bringing up issues that they're not even really talking about. So they're talking about perhaps some financial stressors at home. Meanwhile, I'm kind of asking about how they're doing in school. And then sometimes over disclosing my personal lives with clients. So to the point that it's an extreme point of a self-disclosure, which is a technique in counseling that it helps create some strengthening of therapeutic bond, and perhaps even normalcy. But if I over disclose to the extent where it's beyond that and it's not helpful to the client, then that becomes a porous boundary. And it might burden the client some more to kind of be aware of this extra information. So maybe I might be over a client that's struggling with divorce issues. I'm over disclosing my separation to extent that I'm oversharing some details, and it's not really beneficial to them. It's more so about me sharing. So that's porous boundary. And there's an element of fearing rejection if this person does not abide to the client's request. So it's a bit of people-pleasing behavior that later on we'll touch on. That could be an indication of something that the therapist might need to work on personally. And then as we move along to the right into the middle, which is what we see as a person with healthy boundaries, they have kind of like some porousness and some walled bound, like intermix of both rigid and porous. And this is where we'd ideally want to be, but it depends on the situation. Clearly, for instance, if we're talking about exploitation, having even healthy boundaries or to cross that particular domain is not acceptable. So healthy boundaries in general, therapists would hold values of their own and the client's beliefs without kind of intermixing or trying to influence the other. And at the same time, they're undifferentiated by the client's own beliefs. So if the client is believing in a certain kind of spiritual practice that therapist is not familiar with, they don't the therapist doesn't necessarily have to adopt that personally to be able to, validate that in therapy. It could be just something that's informational and just to, understand of the clients. And then also the therapist being aware of their own wants and needs and communicate them clearly to clients. So it kind of goes back to Wapp's comments on setting your own boundaries requires a bit of knowing what, the therapist wants and their needs are, because they could be unique to each. And this also provides some modeling for our clients as well. A lot of the clients that I've worked with come to counseling with interpersonal issues. And a lot of times, boundary concerns do come up. So modeling our own boundaries as therapists to our clients helps them learn for themselves as well and apply into their own lives. And then again, we talk about self-disclosure here, and it's about the appropriateness of self-disclosing. So I had a client that was having pretty intense social anxiety around internship and having to expose herself to interns and kind of being, having to consult with her supervisor and amongst others. And so with that kind of anxiety, I did also share similarly, I had to do, these presentations and group consults, and I disclosed to that extent, but nothing more. It was more so to provide her kind of a sense of, I'm with you. I can understand kind of the anxiety. And also not to take from them. You always kind of circle back to, I can understand this is kind of what you're challenged with. So an empathetic kind of response. So that would be appropriate. And then acceptance of the clients, even when they refuse your request. So say, for instance, you suggest a particular strategy. I've had clients perhaps not have good experiences or didn't think that, mindfulness strategies were really helpful. So they clearly, when I brought it up, they're like, nope, been there, tried that, move along. And then I'd be like, okay, understanding there's a wide range of strategies, and the client in front of me is the client that I'm tailoring my the treatment plan for, and it's not really about me. So just not being offended if they don't accept a certain suggestion of mine. And this kind of focuses on kind of person-centered or client-focused counseling that a lot of our newer aged therapy models do. It's almost, I feel, it's a basic expectation. And then going into the far right is the rigid walling. So it's complete walling of the man. And this is where we call overly rigid boundaries, where a person could be overly protective of personal information. Say the client's asking therapist, myself, like how my day was, and I'm just completely not going to answer that. That's kind of might rupture rapport, where it could be seen as overly cold to the client. So we want to be careful to be not overly protective, but at the same time, you can respect certain personal information to be not shared, or there could be a different kind of response. And then rarely asking for help. I guess this is kind of like a bit of a experience of my own when kind of I felt like imposter syndrome and worried that I might internship I was told is kind of like, though we are learners and we're treated as students, and it's generally understanding if we're not really sharp on interventions because we're new, but there's still an element of worry that we are performing for a long-term interview. So to an extent, we got to ask ourselves, how overly rigid could we be, and balancing our need to be ethical versus what our own fears are. And then with that, having few close relationships by virtue of being walled up, people might not, want to gauge you as much, and avoid closeness with others for fear of maybe being hurt. Just as an example of an underlying reason, and detached in even close relationships. So for this presentation, we'll focus more so on the far left of that diagram before, on porous, specifically limited, non-existent to loose or porous boundaries. And so I'll go a little bit deeper on how boundary crossings could look like. And in context of counseling, it could look like sometimes we're overlooking a particular boundary. So perhaps if I needed to really quickly send an email and it's past my usual office hours I share with clients, I'm gonna I might quickly send an email or respond to an email, but so that would be considered a boundary crossing. And it's not always harmful. Okay. So there are times where dual and multiple relationships could be considered. If, for instance, a client is, seeking services, and they're in an area where they don't have really a lot of options. So we can see this in maybe rural areas where maybe the counselor they seek is someone that they already know outside of that professional relationship, like a peer, or maybe a church member. So that would be considered perhaps acceptable boundary crossing, and it's not always harmful. Although in the codes and from what my practicing supervisor would say is that usually short term, we should make sure that it's recorded and it's short term and it's beneficial. So it's really targeted, and it's not, and we got to make sure that it's controlled. Hence why a short term might, as short term as possible, would be the ideal okay for that. And yeah, again, it's reasonable departures from accepted routines, such as if I'm answering email past office hours, that's a time boundary. And then it may cause the mental discomforts, which we'll go into later on. And touched on earlier that there are additive impacts that could lead to burnout. And now, with that said, a boundary crossing could turn into a boundary violation here, where, for instance, it could be self-serving or harmful. So perhaps, I'm bartering for some reason, a client is not able to afford their services, and, we allowed for them to, we have a bartering arrangement for them to clean my office in exchange for counseling. And I've been kind of keeping them longer in their services than they actually need to, just so I can keep their cleaning ongoing for myself. So that would be self-serving and exploitative. And so again, with the original dual and multiple relationships, even if it is acceptable, it could impair professional judgment Hence, throughout the plan of being approved, still to document perhaps the duration, the plans in place on how to mitigate risk of harm. So then an example of, a unacceptable outcome in terms of prolonging typical short-term therapy to a friend, that's someone that I hold multiple relationship with, would be avoided. And again, earlier I mentioned there's certain behaviors that are strictly boundary violations that are unacceptable. So they're exploitative and sexual relationships, which I won't touch on because those are clear. So this is kind of an interesting slide and also kind of scary. So perhaps when we talk about how to navigate boundaries, we should kind of fundamentally kind of know ourselves as humans and as therapists humans. We do each of ourselves carry what's called blind spots, which are basically baggages of personal values and morals that may possibly be incompatible with professional mandates and boundaries. And so if I come from a culture where greeting is, kiss on the cheek, and I'm so used to doing that, it's like part of my value system, part of my greeting system, yet in a Canadian kind of setting where we greet clients, I'm not talking about even COVID, I do that could cross violations or cross, a client's comfort zone. I wouldn't quite call this a boundary violation. So this is where the gray area is, but perhaps part of best practices, it might be a safer option to just not do the kiss on the cheek. And then a boundary decisions, and another point to unconscious factors that impact our boundary decision making is that these decisions are made prior to our awareness at times. I'd say much like any other decision, like ethical decision making. For instance, if our client is, really, crying and it just expressed, a loss in their lives, our empathetic impulse may be to quickly self-disclose and comfort the client. And to that, perhaps they only really need space, but our reaction had just taken over clinical judgment, and that crosses a boundary with what the client's needs are at that time. And another unconscious factor is actually, this one's more of once we become aware of our unconscious tendencies, we might tend to use cognitive shortcuts in what we call conscious decision making. And we might start self-imposing rules across situations, much like the rigid boundary holder on the far right in the previous diagram. And this could be like him habituating like no disclosure at all. And that might be overly rigid and impact developing therapeutic rapport with that client. And then finally, our decision making could be colored by personal characteristics over ethical judgment, as the previous examples I just mentioned do touch on. So say my personal discomforts with my client crying, this time I could be, maybe abruptly ending the session because it's too uncomfortable for me, rather than tending to the client's needs at that time. And now with this slide, we look particularly at 5 types of professional boundaries that I found that are relevant to counseling. So first one is the physical boundaries. Could be, a crossing could look like greeting a client with a hug or a kiss, like I've just mentioned. And then a violation would be inappropriate touching of sexual nature. An intellectual or mental boundary crossing could look like sharing unsolicited views on politics or beliefs it could differ from the client, for instance. And then a violation could be going further and harassing the client based on their political affiliations, or providing therapy for a client who is clearly intoxicated and don't have the mental capacity to find therapy beneficial. An emotional boundary crossing could be self-disclosing personal feelings beyond what's helpful to the client. A violation emotionally would be maybe criticizing or belittling a client's behaviors. And again, with sexual exploitation, it could be expressing sexual feelings toward the client. And material boundary crossing could be allowing client to pay later than specified in site policy. So this is something that I have personal experience with, and I could understand and the challenges sometimes within a 50 to 60-minute session, sometimes going through so much material and assessments, we tend to forget taking this payment. It takes 2 minutes and sometimes it's overlooked. But you can tell that it's not good practice to keep making this, habituating this, because that also crosses boundaries for a client on the other side, that it's okay to not pay. And that in itself could impact my obligations to my site. And then in the long run, even for if I were to go privately, respect for my own services. And that could lead to, resentment. So it's best to be, so that would be a boundary crossing that with different kind of consequences. And then a material violation could be, again, on money, but charging a client more than agreed upon rate. And then a time boundary could be, again, some of the challenges that I've dealt with, especially earlier on and in a site where it's a little bit more structured and more mandatory assessments involved. There's a lot on my agenda, and at times I let it go over time. But again, as we learned, going over time not only takes time away from other clients and myself, but it also teaches the client perhaps that this is what they might expect with other counselors too. So to honor what is a general practice, which is keeping within a certain time limit, it's best to kind of keep within that. And of course, it's a crossing, right? Sometimes there might be situations where, a client, needs a little bit more validation near the end. They're crying. And so those are kind of exceptions. So a time boundary violation could be using out of office time to counsel client. And especially if we're not running in private and we're a student and under supervision, when we do this while the site is off or our supervisor is off, this poses risks to ourselves should we need assistance, and also to the client as well. So I've learned from my experience that this would be a violation, the particular site that I've worked with. So really also good to be familiar with the site's holidays when they're off, the office hours, and to work within those time frames as well. And so a question about why do professional boundaries matter to us? As counselors, we are at risk population for burnout because we work so intimately with clients. We're shared details of their personal lives they wouldn't share with others. So there's a lot of burden on our shoulders to hold that space for them. And there's expectations to be ourselves as nurturing and empathetic. With that, we are not quite not disingenuous that we don't care, but at times, even when ourselves are impacted by a client story, we have to kind of almost hold a hat of continual empathy for others, and we might forget about ourselves. And I'm not quite sure if there's still too much stigma nowadays around counselors to seek their own help for burnout as a sign of weakness. Over the years in working in the human service industry, even outside of counseling, there's been a lot of support of self-care as professionals. But nonetheless, it's very, very important. It's highly Um, my site fortunately has a culture of making sure that we are taking care of ourselves. We have the support we need from supervisors and our colleagues. So fortunately, that's kind of a buffer, right? But underlying this stigma, if it still doesn't exist, as counselors, we're expected to be stronger for our clients, and we don't want to let them down. And sometimes I've been pretty bad at, not saying no at times. So kind of, taking on one more client. What's another client onto my already packed caseload? And then, so it's also paradoxical because we kind of know all this information. We've been ingrained through our studies, and for me, working in the human service industry, and a lot of my fellow interns who have worked in human services or school counselors, former caregivers, they were probably trained of all this kind of self-care stuff, but um, still there's almost like minimizing their own susceptibility, almost like a superhuman facade, I'd like to call, um, that they can hold. They might not need as much self-care as they really do need. And then meanwhile, they're still exposing themselves further into managing continual work demands. And I'd like to say that, Vi, that's been the balance of the intern student in my practicum. So I feel for them. And also, the dangerous and scary part of boundary crossings is that they could be pernicious because they might not have any direct impacts that might be noticed right away. So, again, like taking on that one more client, to us, it might be rationalized as sunk cost. We already had 5 clients today. What's one more? Well, one more could tip us over to burnout, as opposed to just stress. And again, like I've mentioned, they do have additive impacts that may not be realized until too late. So crossing a time boundary, 3 times a week as opposed to, once a month, the former could lead to even more tiredness, more burnout.